I don't care who your father supposedly is. You two aren't getting on this flight. The words snapped through the crowded terminal like a whip. Eric Dalton, the gate agent, glared at two black teenagers standing frozen in front of him. Jamal and Aaliyah Carter clutched their first-class boarding passes, their Wellington Prep uniforms marking them as students from one of Atlanta's most elite schools. Around them, passengers exchanged smug looks, whispers curling through the line. Another case of entitled kids trying to play above their means. They thought, but then something shifted. Aaliyah's trembling stopped. Her spine straightened, her dark eyes locked on Eric with a calm so sharp it cut. She raised her phone with steady hands and said, "We're calling our father." The silence that fell over gate 32 was instant and absolute. Dalton's fingers froze mid-keystroke. The smirks vanished. Everyone watching realized at the same time they had just underestimated the wrong family. The terminal pulsed with its usual morning rhythm. 1,000 small stories moving at once. Suitcases rattled across the floor. Voices mingled in overlapping conversations. And the smell of burned espresso drifted from a kiosk near the escalators. October sunlight spilled through the wide glass walls, laying bright stripes across the polished tiles of Hartsfield-Jackson. To most travelers, it was just another Tuesday. For Jamal and Aaliyah Carter, it was supposed to be the first day of they had arrived earlier than necessary, just as their father insisted. Raymond Carter never trusted Atlanta traffic and trusted airlines even less. If you're early, you're prepared. If you're late, you're weak. He had told them the night before while double-checking their itineraries at the kitchen table. Raymond was not a man who repeated instructions, so both twins knew he expected them to carry his lessons into every 3 hours before departure. They wheeled matching Navy suitcases through the check-in area, their Wellington Prep uniforms drawing polite nods from strangers. Jamal was tall and carried himself with deliberate confidence, a boy already rehearsing for the man he planned to become. Aaliyah's movements were lighter, sharper, her gaze always scanning, cataloging details like snapshots. Between them there was an unspoken rhythm. He steadied. She observed. The counter of Atlantic Premier Airlines gleamed like a set piece, all marble and brass. The velvet ropes arranged in perfect symmetry. The attendant behind the desk wore a polite smile that looked practiced enough to survive hurricanes. "Boarding passes, please," she said. Jamal handed them over, his motions crisp. The scanner beeped. The printer whirred, and 2 glossy tickets slid into her hand. "First class, row 2, you're all set." It was over in seconds. No questions, no obstacles. Aaliyah snapped a photo of the tickets, sending it to their father with a caption, "Checked in, no problems." For a fleeting moment, everything felt easy. They had done it. They were traveling alone, without chaperones or assistants, their father finally trusting them to navigate the world with nothing but his training and their wits. Security came next, and with it the familiar pinch of scrutiny. Jamal caught the way an officer's eyes lingered on him as he slid his laptop into a tray. The stare carried no words, yet the meaning was clear. Young black man, expensive clothes, something doesn't add up. He forced his jaw not to clench, forced his breath to remain steady. Aaliyah noticed too, and while they laced their shoes back on, she whispered, "You good?" He gave the only answer that wouldn't draw more attention. "Always." Once through, they found their gate and settled near the wall, bagels in hand. From their seats they had a clear view of the monitor flashing Flight 847 to LaGuardia, boarding 10:01 a.m. Around them swirled the usual mosaic of travelers, business people thumbing through emails, families juggling toddlers, college kids with duffels twice their size. The twins fit in and yet didn't. They looked like the picture of discipline. Pressed blazers, matching backpacks, identical expressions of quiet focus. And for a time it seemed the morning might pass uneventfully. At 9 o'clock, the man who would shatter that illusion arrived at gate 32. His name tag read Eric Dalton. Mid-40s, thinning hair clipped short, his tie cinched too tightly, as if strangling patience out of him. He moved with quick efficiency, arranging stacks of zone tags, flicking through the computer screens, testing the microphone. But everything about his posture carried the weight of someone who believed his job was not just to process passengers, but to judge them. A young mother asking about a stroller received an answer so clipped it bordered on a dismissal. An elderly man fumbling with his phone earned a theatrical sigh. Dalton's authority extended beyond procedure. He wielded it like a weapon sharpened by years of small cruelties. The twins noticed almost immediately. "That's our storm cloud," Aaliyah murmured. Jamal smirked faintly. "Then we walked straight through." Neither said aloud what they both knew. Storms don't care if you see them coming. The minutes crawled. Pre-boarding was called for families, then military personnel, then first class. At 9:55, Jamal and Aaliyah rose together, smoothing their blazers before stepping toward the gate. They looked every bit like the students their school celebrated in glossy brochures, articulate, ambitious, unshakably polite. Boarding passes ready, they approached the podium. Dalton didn't scan the tickets. He looked at them, then at the twins, then back at the slips of paper again. His gaze narrowed, suspicion flickering into disdain. "These are first-class tickets," he said flatly. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, his voice calm. Dalton's eyes lingered, measuring them as if their worth could be tallied in an instant. "And you expect me to believe you paid for them?" The words weren't loud, but they struck like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations around them paused. A couple of passengers leaned closer, smirks tugging at their mouths. To the crowd, the story was obvious. Two kids trying to bluff their way into seats they couldn't possibly afford. "We didn't pay for them," Jamal answered, each word chosen carefully. "Our father did." Dalton's lip curled, halfway between a smirk and a sneer. "Sure he did." He set the tickets down without scanning them. "You two need to step aside. This line is for first-class passengers." The murmurs behind them grew louder. Someone chuckled under their breath. Another muttered, "Entitled." The judgment swelled like a tide, drowning the quiet confidence the twins had carried all morning. Heat crept into Aaliyah's face, humiliation pressing against her chest. She looked at Jamal, saw his jaw tighten, the flicker of anger he fought to contain. And then something in her shifted. It wasn't rage, but clarity. She drew in a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and lifted her chin. The phone slid into her hand as naturally as a blade unsheathed. Her voice, when it came, was not trembling. It was calm, even, and frightening in its precision. "We're calling our father." Silence fell across gate 32. Dalton froze, his fingers suspended above the keyboard. The passengers who had been smirking only moments earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Something in her tone cut deeper than youth should allow, an authority that carried the weight of a name everyone in Atlanta knew. Even if they didn't recognize these twins by sight, Jamal didn't add a word. He didn't need to. His stillness was its own statement. The air itself seemed to tighten. Every sound in the terminal muffled under the weight of that single sentence. For the first time since stepping behind his podium, Dalton hesitated. He wasn't just looking at two teenagers anymore. He was facing the Carters, and everyone in the gate area felt the balance shift. What had begun as an ordinary morning was no longer ordinary. It had become the opening scene of something no one there would forget. The silence at gate 32 didn't last long. Silence never does in an airport, especially not in Atlanta, and especially not when a scene is unfolding that people know will play differently once the rest of the world sees it. At first it was just a cough here, a nervous shuffle there, but then came the glow of phone screens. One, two, then half a dozen. Passengers who moments ago were smirking at the Carter twins now angled their cameras forward, pretending to be subtle. As if anyone could miss the sudden for Aaliyah saw the reflection of herself in one woman's phone case, her own face framed against the gate agent's rigid posture. She didn't flinch. If anything, she straightened further. Her father had always told them the most dangerous weapon in any room wasn't fists or money. It was narrative. And once narrative escaped the boundaries of four walls, it could never be recalled. Dalton realized what was happening a second too late. "Put those phones away," he barked at no one in particular. The command only spurred more movement, more red lights blinking, more lenses pointed at him. His authority had shrunk to the size of his podium, and the crowd smelled it. Jamal stayed perfectly still. Every nerve in his body screamed to shove back against the humiliation. But restraint was armor now. His eyes stayed locked on Dalton, cold and steady, while the quiet chorus of typing fingers rose behind him. Hashtags began forming in real time, lines of commentary spilling into the ether before the twins even knew what words were being attached to their faces. By the time Dalton cleared his throat and forced a smile, he didn't feel clips of him sneering. "You expect me to believe you paid for them? We're already climbing out of Gate 32 and onto timelines across Atlanta?" One woman in a red jacket whispered, "This is going viral," as if she were announcing the weather. Aaliyah's phone vibrated. Notifications stacked so fast her lock screen blurred. She saw her own image already clipped, looped, captioned with words like entitled or profiled, and Gate 32, ATL. The world had stepped into their story, uninvited but unavoidable. Dalton's voice came again, harsher now. "You two need to step aside until this is cleared up." He tried to sound firm, but even he heard the weakness. The crowd had shifted allegiance. A minute ago, they were content to let him play executioner. Now, with the possibility of public shame looming over them all, passengers avoided his gaze, pretending to be absorbed in their phones while secretly recording everything. One man in business casual muttered, "This isn't a good look." Another, braver, said it louder, "Just scan their tickets." The words struck like a stone against glass. Dalton flushed, his authority cracking under the weight of witnesses who no longer feared him. Aaliyah didn't speak again. She didn't have to. She let the silence, the cameras, and the quiet hum of 1,000 online strangers do the work. She tapped her phone once and sent a live update to her father. "They're trying to block us. People are filming." The dots on the screen jumped as he typed back, but she didn't open the reply. Not yet. Across the city, within minutes, the footage landed on feeds of influencers who had no connection to Gate 32, no knowledge of the Carters, but recognized the taste of virality. Captions grew sharper. "Two teens in uniform denied first class by gate agent." Guess why? Memes sprouted like weeds. Twitter threads spun theories about wealth, race, entitlement, and abuse of power. Back in the terminal, Jamal caught whispers of his own name. "Did you see his face?" someone said behind them. "They don't even look surprised, like they've dealt with this 1,000 times." Another voice. "They're saying their dad is Raymond Carter." Utrana, the name traveled fast, repeated with awe, with doubt, with curiosity. Some people scoffed. Others nodded knowingly. Truth mattered less than perception, and perception was already flooding out of the airport at light speed. Dalton finally scanned the tickets, each beep louder than necessary, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Bored," he muttered, but the command landed hollow. The twins stepped forward without hurry, their footsteps deliberate, every movement caught on half a dozen lenses. They walked down the jet bridge not as two students on their first solo trip, but as the eye of a storm already swelling beyond the glass walls of Hartsfield-Jackson. By the time they reached their seats, the first national news alert was being drafted. By the time they buckled in, hashtags had crystallized into a single phrase stamped across thousands of timelines. And by the time the cabin door closed, Gate 32 had ceased to be a place. It had become a symbol, a story, and a fight the Carters hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. The engines roared, the plane rolled back from the gate. Jamal looked out at the terminal fading behind him. The image of raised phones still burned into his mind. Aaliyah glanced at her screen again, at the avalanche of notifications piling higher. Neither spoke. but both understood. The real flight wasn't to New York. It was into a storm made of pixels, opinions, and headlines. And there was no gate agent alive who could keep them from boarding that. The plane lifted from the runway, engines shaking the cabin as Atlanta dropped away beneath the clouds. For a moment, Jamal and Aaliyah sat in silence, their hands gripping the armrests. It wasn't fear of flying. Neither of them minded turbulence. What shook them was the sense that something bigger than steel wings was carrying them now. They had stepped onto Flight 847, but the real departure had already happened back at Gate 32. Aaliyah's phone vibrated nonstop. She tried to silence it, but the screen pulsed with light like a heartbeat she couldn't ignore. Mentions, tags, direct messages, hundreds, then thousands, stacking faster than she could swipe them away. She opened one post at random. It showed Dalton's face frozen mid-sneer, captioned with the words, "You expect me to believe you paid for them?" The clip already had 30,000 views. By the time she refreshed, it was at 50. Jamal leaned over, eyes narrowing. "That's fast. It's already gone," she whispered. "We can't stop it." Across the aisle, a businessman scrolled through his tablet, frowning. Jamal glimpsed the headline flashing on the man's screen. Atlanta teens denied first-class seats. Racial profiling at Gate 32? It wasn't even an hour old, but the story had leapt from shaky phone videos to polished articles with logos attached. Meanwhile, on the ground, Raymond Carter was standing in his glass-walled office downtown, phone pressed to his ear. His assistant hovered in the doorway with a stack of papers forgotten in her hands. The CEO of Carter Real Estate Holdings was not a man easily rattled, but his face was carved into something harder than anger, colder than shock. "My daughters," he said into the receiver, his voice razor sharp, "at my airport, harassed, humiliated, and it's on every screen in this city." The person on the other end stammered, tried to calm him, but Raymond cut them off. "No, you listen. I don't care if it's Atlantic Premier Airlines or the entire damn terminal authority. They will answer for this. Today." He ended the call, already dialing another number, his reflection burning back at him from the office glass. Back in the sky, the cabin buzzed with a different kind of turbulence. Passengers whispered, glanced toward the twins in row 2, then back to their screens. Some offered sympathetic looks. Others pretended indifference. But everyone was watching. Aaliyah's face appeared on TikTok loops with captions like "Grace under fire," and "That stare could freeze stone." Jamal's stillness was turned into memes about silent strength, the kind of imagery that outlives the moment itself. The airline's corporate office felt the blow first. Within hours, their PR inbox flooded with demands for comment. Hashtags like #Gate32, Sir Flying While Black, and Carter Twins trended simultaneously, climbing charts usually reserved for celebrity scandals and political feuds. The social media team scrambled, drafting bland statements about reviewing procedures, but each release was met with more fury, more screenshots, more stories from travelers sharing their own scars. News anchors picked up the thread before noon. A polished voice on a major network said, "The footage out of Atlanta this morning shows what many are calling a textbook case of racial profiling. Two high-achieving students from Wellington Preparatory, Jamal and Aaliyah Carter, were denied boarding despite holding first-class tickets purchased by their father, prominent businessman Raymond Carter." The anchor's tone carried that mix of outrage and intrigue that guaranteed ratings. Raymond himself became part of the narrative faster than he could stop it. Reporters dug into his biography, his rise from Southside neighborhoods to real estate empire, his reputation for discipline and philanthropy. Headlines framed him as both victim and powerhouse. Mogul's children targeted at airport. Interviews with neighbors painted him as the man who never forgot his roots, who built scholarships and funded community centers. Every detail added fuel to the fire. On the plane, Jamal finally broke the silence. "This is bigger than us now." Aaliyah's eyes flicked to her screen again. A notification from her father sat at the top. Stay calm. Land in New York. I'm handling it. She locked the phone without replying. Her hands were trembling now, not with fear but with the weight of being seen by millions. The captain's voice cut through the cabin speakers, cheerful and unaware. We'll be touching down in LaGuardia in about an hour and a half. Weather looks good in New York. The words felt absurd, like background music in a movie where the real drama was unfolding off stage. Meanwhile, outside the plane, protests of a digital kind surged. Influencers with millions of followers shared the clip. Civil rights activists called for accountability. Even celebrities added their voices, turning Gate 32 into a rallying cry. One tweet read simply, "If this happens to the Carter's kids, what happens to the rest of us?" It was retweeted 500,000 times in 3 hours. Dalton, the gate agent at the center of it all, sat in a back office at the airport, pale and sweating as supervisors questioned him. He stammered excuses about procedure, about suspicious behavior, but the words rang hollow against the backdrop of viral evidence. Cameras had captured not just his actions, but his tone, his disdain, the smirk that no policy manual could defend. The airline's executives convened in a glass tower hundreds of miles away. Suits around a long table argued over damage control, while a screen on the wall replayed the same 30-second clip over and over. "We can't just apologize," one said. "We need the Carters on our side." Another countered, "It's too late. This is out of our hands." The argument stacked until someone finally whispered the truth. "This isn't about procedure anymore. This is about survival." Back in row 2, Jamal leaned his head against the seat, eyes closed, but his mind refused rest. He thought of the looks in the terminal, the laughter before silence, the way power shifted the moment phones came up. Aaliyah sat beside him, screen glowing against her face, the weight of 1,000 strangers' words pressing against her chest. She turned the phone over, letting it rest in her lap. Neither spoke for the rest of the flight. They didn't need to. They could feel it building all around them, a firestorm that had started with a single spark at Gate 32 and was now roaring unchecked across the country. By the time the wheels touched down in New York, it would no longer be just their story. It would be a movement, and movements don't land quietly. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was designed to impress, but tonight it felt like a cage. Glass walls overlooked the skyline, the city below flickering with lights as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Inside, though, every suit around the polished oak table knew the world outside was already judging them. Screens glowed at the far end of the room, replaying the 30-second clip from Gate 32 on a loop. Each time Eric Dalton's voice sneered, "And you expect me to believe you paid for them?" Another wound opened. Another argument began. The airline's CEO, Victoria Harrington, stood at the head of the table. Her hair was pulled tight, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. "We've issued 2 statements. Both have been rejected by the public. The hashtags are still climbing. Stock fell 4% at close. We are hemorrhaging trust." An executive to her left cleared his throat. "We need a settlement offer. Get ahead of this before the Carters file suit." Another, younger, leaned forward. "A settlement won't touch this. We're not in the courtroom. We're on the front page of every feed in America. People don't want money. They want blood." Silence fell when the door opened. Victor Carter walked in without announcement, his tailored suit carrying the weight of authority that none of their designer clothes could mimic. His presence filled the room the way storms fill skies. Silent, inevitable, unstoppable. He did not sit. He didn't need to. "Mr. Carter," Harrington began, voice carefully measured. You were just scrambling," he cut in, his voice even but sharp enough to split stone. "While you scrambled, my children were humiliated, filmed, judged, dragged through the mud for daring to sit in seats their family paid for in full. And now, while you sit in this tower, the world is tearing you apart because of one of your employees." No one interrupted. No one dared. Victor paced slowly along the table, his hand brushing the leather chairs without ever settling into one. His eyes moved from face to face, pinning each executive in place. I built my empire from the ground up. I know what it means to be dismissed, underestimated, told I don't belong. But my children, they were born into a world where they should never have to prove their legitimacy with every step. Yet here we are, Gate 32, a reminder that money, education, achievement, all of it means nothing when prejudice wears a uniform. Harrington clasped her hands tightly, knuckles whitening. Mr. Carter, we are deeply sorry for... Sorry? His voice rose, not in volume but in force, commanding the air itself. You are not sorry. You are afraid. Afraid of the stock drop. Afraid of your board. Afraid of the headlines that will brand you for what you are. You're not apologizing to my family. You're trying to survive. The words landed like hammer blows. One executive shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at his notes, pretending to read. Victor stopped at the head of the table, directly across from Harrington. You don't get to choose survival this time. The choice belongs to me. My children were humiliated on your watch by your man in your uniform. And now the world knows. You will not contain this with statements. You will not bury it in settlements. You will stand up and admit the truth, that your airline failed, that your culture enabled this, that your gate agent believed two black teenagers could not possibly sit in first class without being frauds. And you will say it out loud, for every camera to hear. Harrington's lips parted, but no sound came. Around the table, glances shot back and forth. Some executives looked horrified, others calculating, but all of them knew he was right. Victor leaned closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Do that, and maybe you live to rebuild. Refuse, and I will dismantle you, brick by brick, contract by contract, until Atlantic Premier Airlines exists only as a cautionary tale in business schools. You think a 4% stock drop is your problem? Wait until I move. Wait until every investor who ever shook my hand remembers what I stand for. And the silence stretched until it cracked. Harrington swallowed hard. We will draft a full statement, a live press conference. With your approval, Mr. Carter, we'll invite you to... No, his interruption was final. You don't invite me. I will stand beside my children, not beside you. This is their story, not your stage. You will admit fault. You will outline change. And you will beg the public for forgiveness. Every word was captured by the phone one of his aides was quietly streaming from the corner. Victor knew it, and he wanted it. He wasn't just speaking to the executives. He was speaking to the millions watching outside the glass tower. Finally, he turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to deliver the final blow. You thought you humiliated the Carters. Instead, you've exposed yourselves, and tomorrow the world will hear you confess it. He left the room without waiting for a reply, his footsteps echoing like judgment. Inside the boardroom, the executives sat frozen, the looping clip on the screen still replaying Dalton's sneer. But now it was overlaid with something worse, the sound of their own silence, and the knowledge that the man who had just walked out could either destroy them or spare them, and that mercy was not guaranteed. Morning broke over New York with headlines already written. Screens in coffee shops, subway stations, and office lobbies glowed with the same footage, the same hashtags, the same story that had grown larger than anyone could control. Gate 32 was no longer just an airport location. It was a symbol. It was a wound. It was a mirror. The Carters woke to it like everyone else, but with the knowledge that they were no longer spectators. They were the story. Jamal and Aaliyah sat at the small table in their Manhattan hotel suite, untouched breakfast trays cooling beside them, eyes fixed on the television. A chyron scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Airline to address Gate 32. Incident in live press conference today. Aaliyah rubbed her temples. They're going to spin it. Jamal shook his head slowly. Not with Dad watching. And in another part of the city, Victor Carter was already moving. His suit was dark, his expression darker, as he stepped into a waiting black sedan. The driver didn't ask questions. He simply pulled into traffic, weaving through the morning rush toward the hotel where the airline had chosen to stage its mea culpa. Cameras had already gathered outside. Reporters shouted questions no one answered yet. Inside the ballroom, executives shuffled nervously behind a podium branded with the airline's logo. Victoria Harrington stood at the center, clutching her prepared remarks, her voice rehearsed but unsteady. When the Carters entered, Victor flanked by his children, every lens in the room swung toward them. The twins carried themselves with a composure that seemed impossible for their age. Jamal's shoulders were squared, his eyes steady. Aaliyah held her chin high, phone in hand, not as a prop, but as a reminder of how this had all begun. Harrington began to speak. The words tumbled out like stones. We failed. We profiled. We humiliated passengers who deserved dignity and respect. We apologize without condition, without excuse, effective immediately. The employee involved has been terminated. But this is not about one man. This is about a culture we allowed to fester, and today we commit to changing it. The room buzzed with the clicking of cameras, the low murmur of reporters noting every syllable. But Harrington's voice faltered when Victor stepped forward. He didn't touch the microphone. He didn't need amplification. His presence was enough. My children don't need your apology, he said, his tone measured, resonant. They need a world where apologies aren't required in the first place. They need to walk through an airport and be seen as who they are, not as what you fear. You say you will change. I will hold you to it, and so will the millions watching. The words traveled instantly, clipped into sound bites, translated into headlines. But for Jamal and Aaliyah, standing beside their father, the power wasn't in the broadcast. It was in the silence that followed, the collective intake of breath from a room full of people who finally understood the weight of what had happened. Reporters shouted questions as the Carters turned to leave. Mr. Carter, will you sue? Jamal, Aaliyah, how do you feel about being at the center of this movement? The twins said nothing. Their silence was louder than any quote. Outside, the city roared with horns and traffic, indifferent to individual lives. Yet the faces that turned toward the Carters on the sidewalk were not indifferent. Some nodded in respect. Others whispered, pointing. A few even applauded quietly, as if recognizing a battle fought on behalf of more than just one family. That evening, back in their hotel suite, the three of them finally sat without cameras, without questions, without the world pressing against the glass. Jamal leaned back against the couch, exhausted. Aaliyah curled into the corner, scrolling through messages of support, of outrage, of solidarity. Victor poured a glass of water, staring out at the skyline. You both handled yourselves with dignity, he said at last, more dignity than they deserved. Remember this. Power is not in the noise. It's in the composure that survives it. Aaliyah looked up, her eyes softer now. Did we win? Victor turned, meeting his daughter's gaze. This was never about winning. It was about being seen. And now the world has no excuse not to see you. They sat in quiet after that, the weight of the past 2 days finally settling over them. Outside, New York pulsed with its relentless rhythm, but in that room the storm had finally broken. The firestorm of Gate 32 would burn in headlines for weeks, in training manuals for years, in memories for a lifetime. But for the Carters, it ended here, not with triumph, not with defeat, but with a lesson etched deep enough to last forever. And for the millions who had watched, shared, and argued, the story carried its own demand. To look closer, to judge less, to remember that dignity is not a privilege, but a right. The feed would move on, as it always does. But the echo of Gate 32 would remain, a reminder of what happens when silence is broken, when phones rise, when truth refuses to stay hidden.